Progress on the 2016 Comprehensive Plan update. All cities and counties in Washington are expected to have their comprehensive plans and development regulations, including critical areas ordinances, updated by June 30th of their deadline year, which is 2016 for the City of Bellingham. If a jurisdiction needs additional time to complete the update, the Department of Commerce recommends the jurisdiction pass a resolution that indicates 1. The efforts that have been made toward updating the comprehensive plan, 2. Specific reasons why additional time is needed, and 3. An unexpected date of completion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Ockett with our Planning Department.
Good afternoon, Council. Greg Ockett, Planning and Community Development Department. Pinky, you just gave my entire presentation. Yeah, the state recommends that we adopt a resolution because we're not going to meet the deadline. You all looked at the schedule this morning. We anticipate finishing in September. And so this is a procedural step that the state recommends that we do. We did this last time when we were quite a bit later than we will be this time. So yeah, staff recommends that you go ahead and approve the resolution, and we will answer any questions.
Councilmember Lillquist.
I move that we recommend passage of the resolution tonight.
Second.
Okay. Council, any discussion? Questions? Wonderful. Well, that was easy. So we have a motion in front of us to pass the resolution for extending our time for the comprehensive plan update. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0 with Dan Hamill excused. Moving right along to item number 2. Thank you, Greg and Rick. Item number 2, addressing the town gown tension, utilizing a coordinated approach to address issues associated with an off-campus housing and behaviors. Lessons learned from Fort Collins Community Town Gown or College Town Gown program. College towns have unique challenges associated with housing, litter, parking, alcohol abuse, and noise in neighborhoods. Many cities have successfully reduced conflicts through implementation of town gown initiatives, including increased education and student government collaboration. The City of Bellingham Planning and Community Development, Police Department, and colleges, through their participation in the Campus Community Coalition, have created a project team to increase coordination and develop recommendations for our town gown implementation. City staff are presenting an overview of the lessons learned from the Fort Collins Town Gown program, including key similarities, difference, and next steps. And this is for information only, and I'll turn that over to Rick Sepler.
Members of the council, in general, the relationship between the city and its colleges is excellent, and we wouldn't want to characterize it otherwise. However, from time to time, in certain neighborhoods in our community, issues arise that are very memorable for the residents and cause a great deal of friction. Those issues are not uncommon to Bellingham. They're found in about 200 communities that have a significant portion of their housing provided within our neighborhoods, or within their neighborhoods in that case. Rather than reinvent the wheel, we believe that it was appropriate for us to learn from the best on strategies that might be applicable, find out how that would work, and bring the information back so we could fine-tune it to our unique circumstances. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Lindsay Kirshner and Ryan Nelson. Ryan will be doing a presentation. I should note that unfortunately Officer Eric Osterkamp was unable to attend, but he did participate in this. And the former Campus Community Coalition representative, Carmen Rasmussen, participated and gave us good input on it. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Rick. So the City of Bellingham received a grant from the Washington State Traffic Safety Commission to address alcohol abuse-related issues in the community that could potentially combine together to address some of our town gown concerns that we've experienced. And so with that, I'll just briefly discuss some of the similarities, some of the differences, some of the lessons learned, and then outline a few of the next steps that we'll be moving forward with as an experience from our lessons learned from Fort Collins. So very similar. Fort Collins is about twice as big as our population within the city, as well as their campus population, which is Colorado State University. About 75% of the students live off campus. They also experience a near zero vacancy rate. So a lot of the data is similar. They also have a really outdoor-focused proximity to a lot of mountains. They also have a very vibrant downtown. They have a brewery culture. So there's a lot of similarities there as well. And I think one of the really unique things that we learned after being there was that they experienced a lot of the challenges that we are currently dealing with now about 10 years ago. So it was really a great opportunity for us to go there, ask them pointed questions about what they did, what worked, and potentially how we could orient ourselves to learn from their lessons and come up with solutions that might be a bit more appropriate for our organization. One of the unique things was they did experience large private student housing complexes, and they were able to tell us how that's changed things. There's been positives and negatives. The initial things were really loud parties, a lot of commotion. Through education, meeting with property managers, and being proactive from the police enforcement at the beginning of the quarters, that helped minimize some of those impacts. And then also there's been some unique impacts in terms of lessening up some of the strain on that single-family residential component, allowing a more diverse amount of users, and increased home ownership within some of the residential single housing stock. Some of the differences, so one of the big ones is resources. They have a lot of resources tied into their programs. They have significantly more police officers that are dedicated for neighborhood services. They have a whole division within their community development team that really focuses on occupancy and nuisance abatement. They also have significant resources up at the college in terms of off-campus housing services, provide a lot of counseling services, educational services. So that's a key difference that I think we're going to have to be mindful of in terms of developing our program. And I guess one of the other differences really is priorities. We've kind of taken a different approach to some of these things, and we've said we're going to focus on life safety first. And so we have a rental registration program. They do not. So that's a huge plus for us. We also have a very sophisticated neighborhood organization. So our ability to work together with the Mayor's Neighborhood Advisory Commission really is very unique, and was something that they were really interested in learning from us because of the ability to really collaborate, communicate some of the issues, and problem solve, as both Carmen and Eric Osterkamp have done for years. So lessons learned. Communication really is key. Fort Collins and Colorado State University have a very close relationship in terms of their campus police, their city police, all different departments within the staff, and multiple different sectors of their educational organization. And so that really does seem to be a key that we could build on. I'm sure we coordinate heavily as it is, but this may be an area that we could increase our coordination and gain some direction forward. They rely heavily upon the students to really develop and market educational programs that are geared towards hosting responsible parties, to occupancy rules and regulations, to what's acceptable in terms of noise levels. And so they've really piloted a very successful program based on students developing the resources, city staff being the experts or having some degree of consultation in terms of what are the code requirements, what are some of the regulatory approaches to things. And I guess to just note on one of the programs that we've kind of focused in on as a potential priority would really be the party registration program. And it's really just centered on an opportunity for students or anyone to register a party. They get a 20-minute heads up. They get a phone call from the police saying, hey, we've received complaints that you're being too noisy. We're going to dispatch somebody out. You have 20 minutes to get things under control. And it really also gives either the police or staff the opportunity to give the students educational materials. A lot of them are making the transition from dormitory to community, and so it really is, many times they don't know how to host a responsible party. So I think that's one of the big takeaways is trying to build on well, the expertise of the students in the college in terms of their educational opportunities, focusing on, I guess, an alternative approach from a service standpoint. And police really are a resource to help out in parties that get out of control. City staff are a resource to help them through educational requirements and what are some of the rules and regulations associated with tenant-landlord situations, things of that nature. From their occupancy and nuisance enforcement program, they're very proactive. So they're driving around, they're looking for problems. They are very successful. They've been able to have anonymous call lines, internet, in terms of responding to things, which is nice because they take the neighbor-to-neighbor conflict away. But it is truly a different approach to resolving nuisance complaints. Another unique component would be their student conduct services. So one of the primary differences between CSU and Western Washington University would be CSU's Code of Student Conduct applies off campus. And after talking to the police department and other staff, that seemed to be something that really brought the university and city together in terms of collaboratively trying to provide additional resources for the students. There's a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of things to come. I think a lot of these obviously are Western Washington University-driven programs, and some of those are a bit more ours. And so we're, from a staff standpoint, excited to work with Western, figure out which of these potential programs are things that they find might be beneficial, and focus in on a few of our different programs and lessons learned to try and gain some traction on how we can address occupancy, how we can address the three unrelated, whether or not we start looking at nuisance rules and regulations, or how we deal with those from either a civil or a criminal manner as well. So we feel like we learned a lot from their programs. As Rick said, this is a great opportunity for us to learn from another jurisdiction that's experienced a lot of things, well ahead of us. And so we're excited to work with Western and figure out some ways that we can help invoke some shifts in what we're currently doing to create a little bit more of a proactive strategy for education and enforcement overall. So in terms of our next steps, we'll be meeting together with Western. We're unfortunate in this situation because we have lost Carmen Rasmussen, who's been great to work with on this project. So we're looking forward to working with her replacement or designee and identifying which of these programs are going to be top priorities for us, and then developing implementation measures and trying to be realistic about, okay, what, probably not going to have the same level of resources that Fort Collins will have, but what are some of those programs that we can use from a phase one approach, and some programs that we can potentially build on. So with that being said, are there any questions at this point in time?
Thank you, Ryan. Councilmember Murphy.
Well, residents love to talk to me about this, especially because I live on a street that has a share of college residents. And the things that I often talk about that I hope we might be able to do outreach about from the city side is that one of the things that I always encourage is developing relationships with your college neighbors, so that, for example, my neighbors like to give me an update of when they're going to have such a party, so I can decide if I'm going to go somewhere else so I won't be adversely affected by it. That's just a nice thing. But also, when a house has become a problem, the thing that I've done in the past and that I advocate for is developing a relationship with the property owner to express the concerns and request that maybe they get tenants that might not be as party prone, or to partner on ways that you can get better tenants. And that has massively helped our street. And lastly, just that if the noise is affecting your quality of life, to definitely report it to the police department, because then that can help tame down the situations and help the students understand that there's certain noise times that are appropriate and not.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thanks, Vicki. So I want to ask about the Campus Community Coalition. As I understand it, it was formed, 20 years ago. And the original focus had to do with alcohol and excessive drinking and partying, kind of like some of the problems you're talking about. Can you help me to understand what exactly is the kind of status of the Campus Community Coalition? Is that a program of the university? Is that the partner we'd be working with most directly, or with somebody or some other office at the university?
I can take that one. The Campus Community Coalition is not just Western. It includes the Community College and the Technical College and Northwest Indian College too. It's, however, a majority of funding I think comes from Western in terms of staffing, and it's increased over time. They see the benefit of dealing with broadly all of the college-age population because the issues are similar on this, and we see them as being a fairly good conduit to each of the institutions to help disseminate it. We've been using that vehicle, for example, to get information out. They host on their page links to us and rental registration, what to look for before you register, what the fees are, in terms of charge. So we've worked fairly well with them. I think they're the best group we have to achieve much of the information early on, because I think that was the truth in Colorado. It was education before they went into the community that set the stage for behaviors afterwards.
Councilmember Barker.
So I'm sad to lose Carmen because having been to many neighborhood associations, we were usually on the same tour, and she was there often and did provide a lot of outreach living in the BTC community area. A lot of connections and a lot of really easy, like what you're talking about, solutions. So I'll be looking forward to see who they find to replace her because they're pretty big shoes to fill. I would be interested in the private student housing, as you suggested, that they did some outreach and education, since we have some coming online pretty darn soon, that as you're talking with Western, that might become a priority so that we can get that education right off the bat with the property owners as well as the management and then the students coming in. So it's my 2 cents on prioritization. Thank you for your presentation. Did you get to go to Fort Collins?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
beautiful.
great. Busy.
Council members, any other questions, comments?
If I
Rick?
might just add one point, the effectiveness of a cohesive program is remarkable. One of the things that Eric would say if he was here, in speaking with his opposite number, they had an 80% reduction in calls for noise. And that's hugely significant. So if that program works and we can transfer it, think of the benefit.
Okay, this was for information only, and we are looking forward to hearing updates on this program. Thank you very much for the presentation. Next item in front of us today is number 3, Sustainable Services Process Update. The city has initiated several processes to evaluate strategies that, if successfully implemented, will ensure the sustainable provisions of services for the community into the future. Staff will update council on the status of the ongoing processes. And again, this is for our level of services. And I'm going to turn it back over to Rick Sepler, our community and
Planning, community,
and community. I
economic
missed a word.
development. It's fine.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah.
Yes. Members of the council, a brief update for you. We spent a great deal of focused time in addressing a coordinated strategy for exploring different alternatives, and that strategy is somewhat dynamic. As decisions are made, it opens the door, closes the door on some options, at least for a period of time, and in response we revise our schedule to bring things forward. We've had some minor adjustments. As council might recall, the MPD has been postponed for consideration for some time. It does mean that we go to our next in-line processes, and you'll note that several have moved forward, and many are in the works right now. Because you're not hearing of it at every meeting doesn't mean the processes aren't moving forward. It means we're actually doing the work. The challenge that comes up for us is that we now await outcomes of the voters' choices because that will inform our next steps in a couple of areas to consider, and that will be in November. Till then, we'll make significant efforts on surplus properties. For example, you'll hear that next and an update on that process. in working with the Mount Baker Theater and working with the museum. You'll note that the Aquatic Center contract management was moved forward in time. It's next up on the queue at this point. And we'll continue the ongoing work in terms of level of service. Parks Committee will be looking at the park level of service. We'll have discussions of that as part of the comprehensive plan. So just a brief update on where we are. The issues have not diminished. They're still at the fore for us, and we'll report back to you on the progress of this third quarter's work shortly.
Councilmember questions. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you, Pinky. So there's a star next to levy lid lift, says first alternative process. Does that mean that it is the second in line now, or it's the first in line now?
It is the first in line pending what happens in November.
Okay, after November, then
And
that would be the
November,
next.
one has to evaluate the outcome of the issues that are before the public and look if that is a viable alternative to be explored. But at this point, it would be premature to really investigate it without seeing the outcomes, because they would certainly influence the direction council and city might go.
Council members, any other questions, comments? Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rick. Okay, we are going to move on to item number 4. Review of potential surplus property criteria and process. Ooh, that's a box on the list. So we're moving right into it. The City of Bellingham currently owns or manages over 5,000 acres of land within Whatcom County. While most of these properties provide a valuable public benefit, some are surplus to the city's needs, either new or in the future. The purpose of the project is to develop criteria for evaluation of city properties to determine and recommend which properties are potentially surplus to the city's needs. The criteria for evaluation will establish a repeatable, transparent, and baseline process for surplus property determination. And I'm going to turn it back over to Rick.
Yes, council members, we are before you to update you on an ongoing process. It is not uncommon for a city to look at its properties and see which ones are needed for the good public works we do or future use, and which ones no longer are needed and might be surplus. So much so that our municipal code asks us to look once a year. The challenge of doing that is, in some cases, we end up reinventing the wheel when we do that, where we look at the same properties which we had come to conclusion on, either the way they were purchased, or they're in a plan, or they're intended for some use, or they're already in a use. We thought that this might be the opportunity to spend a little more time and develop a process that is taking advantage of our geographic information systems that basically puts attributes to properties so that subsequent councils, city administration, and others raising these concerns will have the benefit of the analysis that was done now in the future and assess changed circumstances. Towards that end, we've asked Kate Newell to develop a preliminary program, and we come before you to share the criteria we'll use before we actually run the program itself, to show you how we're framing the specific properties that will emerge. And I'll turn that over to Kate.
Thanks. Kate Newell, GIS analyst with the Planning and Community Development Department. And as Rick said, we're just going to take you through the criteria we developed to identify surplus property. The process is largely based on existing GIS data, and it establishes a repeatable and documented process. We start with all of our city-owned property. This is around 4,500 acres over 800 individual tax parcels. And then we run it through a series of evaluations, or more a process of elimination. The first step in the evaluation is looking at our existing facilities and their current use. So we run this through the GIS model using our existing data. We flag any existing storm, sewer, water facilities, anything that's being used for a neighborhood or city park, trail properties, any government offices or public buildings such as fire stations. These are all flagged through a GIS process. The next step is an environmental evaluation. We flag any properties that are in the Lake Whatcom watershed. These are properties we would not want to surplus. Anything with a conservation easement on it, and anything encumbered with a critical area or highly environmentally sensitive. So we're looking at wetlands, stream corridors, that type of information. So these first two steps are really GIS-based. They're very data-driven. It's a process that we'll create. It can be repeated annually, quarterly, as often as we like, to see if anything has changed as it runs through the process, each property is being individually flagged with that criteria that it hit, so it's very well documented. Just from a kind of manual preliminary analysis that I've done, this is about 90% of our properties. So a lot of our properties have a real current use, an existing use to them. That's a good thing. With the kind of leftover 10% of the properties, the project team's proposing at this point we go on a case-by-case evaluation. We look at it on a parcel level. We're going to be looking at things like purchasing funds and whether there's restrictions or complications associated with that, any restrictive covenants, use agreements, future planning, master planning purposes, any potential trading stock. So this is the kind of information that doesn't necessarily exist in a spatial data set. There's some institutional knowledge involved here that we need to look at these properties individually. And again, we believe just preliminary that's about 10%, around 100 properties we'd be looking at. This is obviously the most time-intensive part of the process, but as Rick said, well worth it because we do this once, we've got it documented. And then after this, ideally we have a handful of properties that have made it through this process, and we can look at those for potential surplus. Let's see here. Just some quick details on the environmental evaluation portion of it. When we're talking about critical areas, this is all stuff that's probably familiar to you, but we're looking at SMP, Shoreline Master Plan regulated streams and shorelines, any of our other riparian corridors, wetlands, anything in the FEMA floodplain or floodway, and anything with a large amount of steep slopes on them. Those are what we're saying are environmentally sensitive. So this is just a little bit of detail on that second step of the process. So we can use GIS to kind of establish how much of a property is environmentally encumbered, and we're looking at anything over 60% saying that's an environmentally sensitive area. And then again, just on the step 3 evaluation details, this really is time intensive because we don't have existing data. A lot of it is in plans here or there. So this is where the chunk of our time will be spent, but it's time well spent. And just a quick timeline, green is where we are right now. We've developed the criteria. We're here today presenting that to you. The next step would be to create the GIS model and run the preliminary analysis. That's steps 1 and 2. And after that, we would be at step 3 when we're looking at the case-by-case evaluation. And that's kind of end of summer, early fall, and hopefully by late fall, end of the year, we would have a handful of properties we've identified that could be surplus to the city's needs. With that, that's kind of our process. If you guys have any questions or comments.
Councilmember Lillquist, then Borneman.
Thank you, Pinky. So I do think this is a really good approach to kind of rationalize how we've been analyzing these. I know we've just did a legal process reform as well. And I think there's a possibility of kind of uncovering some kind of hidden opportunities, some odd little pieces of property. But actually what I really want to talk about is a really obvious piece of property that the city declared surplus to our needs during the waterfront planning process a couple of years ago, for which we already have a written agreement with the port to assume this surplus property. And I've actually tried, I think, 2 different times in the budget process to get us to surplus this property, which is pegged at around $800,000 that the city owns we don't need. It's on Roeder Avenue. I'm just wondering if this will help shake loose properties like that, because that's some money that we could have turned around and put into capital projects on the waterfront if we had begun the surplusing process a year ago or so.
Mayor, did you want to answer that? Is that okay?
Yeah. No, I think I'm very supportive of this. We have gone through in the 5 years I've been here looking at individual pieces of property to surplus, which we didn't have all of that analysis done that Rick and his team is going to do. And then pieces of property like, well, this one could be surplus, let's surplus this one. I think that this rational process here will meet the kind of the hit by the truck theory I run under, which is if you get hit by a truck or I do, we have something in place that goes on after we're gone. I guess it could not be hit by a truck because somebody said that's kind of violent. But the idea is that we are establishing something that when you bring up, there's this piece of property, we have, either we have something to run it through, or we will have run it through a process. So it's not just Michael brought up a piece of property, let's talk about that one. Or we had that property in Samish Way that James brought up, last year, out of all the park properties that we had looked at. But this is more data-based, some subjective when we get down to some of the other steps. But I think it's going to work very well to give a rationale for me to bring something to you and for you to try to determine what it is. So as with this property you're talking about, we didn't have something like this in place back then, but we are going to now.
Well, to be clear, I didn't discover this property myself. It was identified through a long and planning process by numerous eyes. It wasn't this process, but it was a process that already identified it as surplus.
I think what it didn't do maybe, and we may come up with the same result, is we didn't look at that very last box that talked about future use, master planning, highest and best use, that kind of thing. We knew we didn't need the property, just like some of the marine area that we did, the marine industrial area. But that could be at the top of the list to look at. But now we have some criteria to measure that, which we didn't have a year ago.
Councilmember Borneman.
Yeah, I guess my question piggybacks on what the mayor just said about that last element of looking at possible future use. What criteria do you, because I understand the part we're not using it now and that kind of thing, but I think it's important that we do take a close look as to what possible uses in the future. And sometimes we don't always know what that might be, but once you get rid of it, then we go pay double next time for the piece of property. So what criteria are we using when we look at the future? Potential future use?
We'll do several. I think one is to look at it through the lens of our adopted documents. Does the PRO plan, does the transportation plan, does our comp plan indicate that there might be a potential in the future to reserve that, if nothing more than trading stock, to help align it? And that's worthy enough to consider. The second is to look at the location and the anticipated growth of the area and say, would it fit, maybe not identified in the next 20-year horizon, but is that one of those things we'll be thankful on 40 years down the road was held? And we'll come up with some basis on it, because you need to do a little future planning, and that's sort of saying beyond the 20 years, when you're serving this area, what are the kind of things you might need? And see if that parcel would be logically located. I do know that once we get something and obtain it, if there is no use, clearly you want to part from it, but if there's a potential use, you want to save it. I did note that we mentioned trading stock, and I don't want to underestimate that. As our UGA and our current city boundary build out, it's inevitable we'll have increased reasonable use issues with critical areas. And some fairly substantial. There are a number of holdings, for example, in Squalicum Creek in the floodplain that we would be loath to see develop, largely because of the risk. Exercising reasonable use, it might be in the city's best interest to say, we'll trade you for these 4 lots that are high and dry for that 20 acres that are could potentially be underwater. And that's savvy. So we'd cue that as good trading stock because it's platted, it's served, and it's easily developable. That would be confused by a singleton property that might be better to let go of in the same location. So
I think that part's really important that we do that.
Councilmember Murphy.
I know not everything in city government happens fast, but my question is, have there been instances in the past, or could there be instances in the future where we'd need to surplus a property quickly, maybe because of some market situation, and would this process maybe possibly, affect that?
Well, typically we have statutorily they create a lot of lead time before you surplus things. It's designed so it's not a very quick process, and it involves a great deal of public notice and opportunity. There are some times where you need to do that. Usually it's working with another jurisdiction. It's been my case where you're dealing with some trade of some sort. But that could be done through government to government, could be done outside of the surplus process.
Mayor Kelly.
Well, and just to clarify, if we go through the process and we've already identified the properties and their characteristics, this process could help it go faster than it would now if we had to go property by property just when they come up.
Councilmember Borneman.
So this is listed as provide direction. What kind of direction are you looking for?
If I might respond, our concern is if you see a flaw in our process or a criteria, we'd like to hear.
Okay.
We'd hate to come back with recommendations and say you didn't consider things that had a view, for example. We would, of course, in this. But if it was omitted, we'd want to know, did we miss something we should put into this mix before we run it?
Councilmember Murphy, Lillquist, and Barker.
Just a quick question. Can we go back to the slide that shows the process? Thank you. If you can go on to other people.
Okay. Councilmember Lillquist and Barker.
Yeah, it just suddenly occurred to me that one of the reasons why we might consider surplusing a property isn't so much that we want to get rid of it, but that someone else wants to acquire it, some other public agency or even a private project that's seeking development. Will that be anywhere in the last step, basically, in evaluating and prioritizing? Not so much whether or not we need it, but whether or not it'd be better in someone else's hands.
That's a very good point. We should ask. Would this serve the community in another governmental agency,
Like
school
public interest in
district,
some
something
other
like
way.
that? Yeah, that makes sense. We should add that criteria.
Like if the county wanted to, I don't know, build a jail downtown, something like that.
Councilmember Barker, then Murphy.
It's Kate, right?
Yes,
Did you do this presentation?
I did, yeah.
So the feedback I have is it's very different than a lot of the other presentations we get. So it was easy for me to digest. It's the way my mind works. So thank you. It was really palatable. So I'm glad that it's on the timeline it is, and I would like you guys to move forward with it, because I think as we look at the parks level of service, it would be very interesting to come back to this and maybe see areas that might be widely overserved and look at those properties. Not to say that we would be surplusing them, but what could they be used for? And so I'm glad we're going to get through this process and then have that to maybe go back and recheck things as we kind of continue on with our processes. So thank you for making it so easy to appreciate it.
Councilmember Murphy.
Yeah, I think piggybacking on Councilmember Lillquist, I was wondering if there could be a financial evaluation to see if it's something that would get the city more money potentially, or, figuring out, again, what's in the best interest of the city for each of these different scenarios.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. So we would tie in, when we get to that kind of third level, we would definitely tie in with finance and their asset management system and look at those kind of equations. The first two steps really kind of knock out the no-brainers, I think, and then we get to that point. We would look at that.
Council members, anything else? Well, personally, I think this is time really well spent. We'll eliminate our one-offs, and a proper list of all the properties that we have, I think, will make better, clearer decisions for us in our planning in our future. So thank you very much for this initiative. Very well laid out, Kate. Thank you. Anyone else? Comments? Councilmember Barker.
Just the last one, and it's for the mayor, especially directing our staff. We, just in watching this from this process, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes to make things seamless and a lot simpler. And I do appreciate that, and I imagine it does take quite a bit of staff time. So in all of these things, and then looking at the commercial code, so very much appreciated it, and I assume most people out there aren't quite aware that that's happening, but thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Kelly.
The council's asked for more information at various different times, and one of the things, and I think you all at one time have acknowledged this, I think the staff is trying very hard to just give you an update instead of wait until the whole project is done. So kind of let's brush you with it first. Let's see if you have any questions about it before we head down this path, which is what today was about. And then let's bring you up to date, because this city hums every day, and it's under the hood, and it isn't always things that you can see that make a difference. But without doing them, we wouldn't get anything done in a responsible way. So I appreciate the acknowledgement, April, of the staff's hard work.
And thank you for the summary statement in the packet as well. These are very, very helpful. Thank you. Okay, the fifth item in front of us today is a proposed ordinance amending the Bellingham Municipal Code. Staff proposes amending the BMC 4.84, disposition of surplus real property, to clarify language and more accurately reflect current real estate transaction practices. And I'm going to turn this over to Peter.
Yeah, Peter Raffato, Legal Department. Amy Cram presented this at the last council meeting on June 6th. And briefly, although it was introduced then, now it is up for first and second reading in front of council. And I think of it mainly as housekeeping with respect to two elements. It eliminates some of the confusion in the prior code, provides more clarity, and secondly, it updates the code to reflect current commercial practice. And so I'll leave it there unless there are any discussion points.
Council members.
Move approval.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? Motion in front of us to pass the ordinance amending Bellingham Municipal Code 4.84. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Peter. The sixth item in front of us today is the interlocal jail facility use agreement. On May 19, 2016, the Whatcom County Executive sent a letter to the mayors of Whatcom County cities proposing a 2-year jail facility use agreement. The letter from the Executive's office requests that cities sign the agreement in advance of July 1st, 2016. The Whatcom County administration has agreed to certain changes proposed by the City of Bellingham. The attached memorandum provides more detail, and I'm going to turn this back over to Peter Raffato, our City Attorney.
Yeah, thank you. Since the last meeting, when this was initially placed in the council packet, this agreement, we have had some back and forth language revisions with the county. And so just to update you on that, as the memo points out, I think of the agreement in its current form, there's sort of three aspects to it. Number one, even in the first draft, the county had adopted what Bellingham had proposed for a workable option for how to make reductions when there's a need to reduce the population in the jail. So that was already part of the proposal. There were additional items. The main highlights are in the memo, where the city proposed certain changes, and most of those changes were accepted by the county with some minor revisions from what the city suggested. And thirdly, there were some questions, I think, for example, with respect to healthcare clearance that the council had. And with respect to that item and with respect to transportation, both of which there were some language changes from the prior agreement we were operating under, it was just clarified that there's no real change in practice. It was just a tightening up of the language on the county's part. So with those 3 points in mind, staff is recommending a vote to approve, authorize the mayor to execute the agreement with option 2. The one other item that was requested by council was an explanation of the increase in the booking fee, and that information request was made to the county, and you see what was provided there in the packet.
Council members, any questions, discussion? Councilmember Lillquist.
So with regard to the booking fee, I think one of the questions that I asked is the county, in a sense, going to charge itself internally if that same booking fee they're now charging the outside entities? And then the number here that they come up with, cost per booking, isn't the number they're charging us. It's actually different. So I'm glad they provided information, but I'm not sure I understand yet exactly how that booking fee is going to be charged to us externally and to themselves internally.
So, well, first of all, I'll address that as to the extent that I can. The mayor also reminded me that one thing to keep in mind with this agreement, it's a 2-year agreement with the possibility of extensions, but it's the understanding that Bellingham has the understanding that if there is a larger agreement reached with respect to a new facility, that we would be looking at some of these provisions as well. So, and this agreement can be modified by agreement of both parties prior to the 2 years or prior to the full term of this agreement. I wanted to point that out. With respect to the question on, that is what the county provided in response to the request. This was an issue of exactly how fees are charged in the prior discussion, and I think it will continue to be a discussion point between the city and the county. But the agreement itself doesn't contain any formula. It didn't before, and this agreement doesn't either. It just says that that will be made as part of the county budget process, and there will be an estimation of costs. So I think that there will be more discussion about that. But at this point in time, there's nothing in this agreement that really affects that.
And what about the consequences?
Well, yeah, I mean, the mayor reminded me of a good point. I mean, we are under a deadline. We do need to have an ability to book individuals into the jail, and so that's where we are.
Okay. All right, any other questions, discussions? Okay. We need to vote to approve. Councilmember Murphy?
I move that we approve the interlocal jail facility use agreement.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 5-0. Thank you very much, Peter, Mayor. Okay, so item number, we approved it. Jean, hope you're okay with that. So item number 7 today is a discussion of a salary commission. Council asked staff to draft an ordinance creating a salary commission for establishing the salaries of elected officials. The attached memorandum provides background and information regarding current Bellingham chapter and code provisions related to salaries, the draft ordinance which is attached, and the anticipated work of the commission. The draft ordinance, which is for discussion purposes, will require council's input prior to final consideration. And keep in mind that elected officials is not just those up here on the dais, but we have many others as well, including in our judicial system. So I'm going to turn this over to Brian Heinrich, our Deputy Administrator, and Peter Rufato, our City Attorney.
Brian Heinrich, Mayor's Office. Thank you. You'll see on this issue the memorandum that outlines existing provisions in the city charter and the municipal code around the elected official's salary. As outlined, the charter does state that the mayor should at no time be less than the highest paid city official. Further, BMC articulates that the mayor's salary will increase the same as our E-team members. And this came up earlier, I believe, that same BMC references that the salary council will increase at 3% annually. That began back in 2014. And then there is another section on the municipal court judge salary as well. And I think we also highlight some of the highlights of the draft ordinance that include the powers of the commission. We are looking for some direction on the size of the commission, whether that's 5 or 7. I don't know if Peter wanted to add anything to that. We have talked about that internally. And I think it's important to remember that, or at least as proposed, the commission wouldn't be a standing commission. It would be sort of an as-needed approach. So it may happen initially and then not for some time thereafter. And you will see then, I think, finally at the end that we'll operate just like we do our other meetings with the Open Public Meetings Act. We did make an estimation on the amount of staff time, or time rather to staff it, that it might take. And then some of the information that the salary commission, we anticipate they would review other salary commission reports from other cities, our own elected officials, salary and benefit history. We'd identify some comparable cities to use, and then things like budget and revenue information for Bellingham we think would be useful in that review. And so, I don't know, Peter wanted to add anything, but we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. Peter Raffato, Legal Department. So if the council is inclined to move forward with an ordinance, this is just a draft ordinance, for discussion. In addition to the size of the commission, you would also want to identify, the way it's set up in here is, it's anticipated that it would be a set time when you would, the commission would be convened, appointed and then convened, but that time period is not identified. There's a blank for that as well. No, but acknowledging that, at least the way it's written, the council could pass a resolution and then actually have it convened at any intervening point. But you would need to come up with whether it's 4 years or 5 years or 6 years. We could talk about that, but.
Peter, can you clarify, meaning that how long or how often?
How often?
Oh, okay, the salaries would change, okay. Council members, questions?
Yes. I think it should be 7 myself, the membership rather than 5. I just think if you get 7 people should be enough, like we're set up here. That's just my opinion.
Council members, any preferences on the size of Councilmember Lillquist, then Murphy?
I was leaning towards 5, but whether it's 5 or 7 members, I don't think it makes much difference. I'm more kind of uncertain about how often. Is this something that happens every 5 years, every 10 years? Not very often at all, I would think. It's more resetting, not on an annual basis, but like every decade, or I don't know. I don't know exactly how long.
Maybe that's something that in our research we could look into, about what other cities, how often they look at it, or
decade
for
is
that
pretty
part
common.
of the conversation. Okay, Councilmember Murphy.
I'm just leaning towards 7, more eyes and more brains thinking about it.
Yeah,
I personally, it does not matter to me to 5 or 7, so I guess it's more about what size of commission, how you can get people to commit to be on the commission and are willing to use their time, because this is obviously a voluntary role. Councilmember Lillquist.
Sorry. One of the things I like about this is it really is, you point to people, they do their work, they can disband as soon as they're done. It's hopefully not too large an ask. The county just went through this process. They had a salary commission, they convened, they made recommendations, they disbanded. I think the county does every 10 years. Is that right? Mr. Gardner, do you know how often the county does it?
They do it.
We did include Mark's earlier document from September of 15, and if you look on page 320, I don't want to steal your thunder, Mark. Go ahead.
2 years.
I see that, yeah, length of term is there, yeah. Yes, we've already provided that.
Some of these cities are annual, some are 5 years. Just to throw this out there, since we're on a biennial budget cycle, we've seen the even numbers, whatever the period should be even numbers, and it would be nice if it's possible to eventually align it with the budget cycle, even if not right away. It might require a, 3-year cycle and then 4-year after that or whatever. But there's nothing in the statute that forces you to choose a particular length of time.
Thank you, Mark. Councilmember Barker.
So since we have so many different commissions, and I realize everybody's schedule is difficult, I would suggest the 5 personally. 2 years seems to set really well. And are we going to talk about, there's a whole section here for miscellaneous provisions or practices. So will it be looking at setting criteria for salary comparison? It looks like right now we're on a set 3%, and that's not something I necessarily agree with. Is that something that we could task them to look at also? Oh, I was just reading.
It's already, Peter, could you?
Okay, so in terms of this is going to be an independent commission, and what it determines will be the last word. It's not a recommendation to council. It's the commission will make its determination, and that will be final. And I don't think that you can put. Have to look at that, but the commission really gets to decide what it wants to look at.
Councilmember Murphy, but also Brian, you had a comment. Are you good? Okay, so Councilmember Murphy and then Mayor Kelly.
I just was hoping to make sure that we would be doing some good community outreach about this, so to try to reduce the thought that, you know, the city fast track a group of people that are going to get the city council raises and stuff like that. Some community outreach would just be appreciated.
Mayor Kelly.
Well, and this is just me, been in public service for a long time. And this is only my idea. This doesn't come from anybody else. But I think that the salary should also be, there should be some change in circumstances if we're looking at the salaries, because obviously the elected officials and the executive and exempt staff get the raises. Yours is set, but the rest of us get them as we negotiate our contracts, which I think is perfectly appropriate. But whether it's a population increase, a change in the job descriptions, you know, some circumstances changing, to me, doesn't happen necessarily every 5 years. That, in some ways, seems like a short period of time, and we've gone a long time without any salary commission looking at our salaries. So I guess I would be one that would look for a longer period of review to ensure that there was changes in circumstances that would justify what we're talking about, because it doesn't have to do with the percentage increase. It has to do kind of with the adjustment in the salary. So that's just my opinion.
Well, a couple things. In response to that, when we look at the chart of all the other areas surveyed, the longest one, there's one at 5 years, and everything else is shorter in terms of the time set. And so I'm just, you know.
This is just my opinion. You guys do what you want.
And I guess from staff, once again, what is it, you want direction, but what specific points do we need to give you today, or that you need to move forward with this? What, you know, because I'm not sure. We saw the one in April brought up, but said, no, that's not what we need. So what specifically do you need?
Yeah, Peter Raffato, Legal Department. There's two blanks currently in the ordinance. One is for how often it's going to occur, and the second choice is how many members on the commission. So there's been some different opinions on that. So a vote on that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay.
I'll just go ahead and throw it out. I'll make a motion for 7. There's 7 of us up here. Why not have 7 people look at it? That's just my opinion, which means absolutely nothing sometimes.
We have a motion for salary commission existing of 7 members. All of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? How many did any? Okay, so I guess that's 6-0. Well, that's settled.
And I'll make a motion, we do a time set of 5 years.
Second.
Discussion. Councilmember Lillquist and then Murphy.
I think that's really close to the right amount. I'm wondering, would you want to do 6-year to match the budget cycle, though?
Or 4 years.
2, 4, or 4 years to match a budget cycle?
Do that.
That wouldn't be too bad.
That's okay. I was just...
Councilmember Murphy, you have a comment, and then we'll finish this up. Go ahead.
Just a question as a part of it. If we do it for a longer term, would we be less able to attract people to commit for that long, is my only concern.
Less than 5? Or
no, what I'm saying is if you set it for 7 years or 5 years, would that decrease your ability to attract people to commit for 5 to 7 years?
Oh, you don't commit to the whole period. You disband. It goes away.
Okay.
So each time, I just want to make sure that we're understanding that clearly. Each time we go through this, a salary commission is appointed, they go through the process, they put forward their recommendations, and then we are deciding on when and if or how often we would reconvene a salary commission. Is that my goal? All right.
I would like to change my motion, though, from 5 to do a salary set for 4 years as opposed to 5.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion in front of us, and this is for how often the Salary Commission would reconvene to reassess and make recommendations, and that is now recommended at 4 years. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 6-0, and that is for how often the Salary Commission would convene. Councilmember Parker.
The shall increase annually by 3%, that was a council direction back, and that would be something if we chose to relook at, we would need to bring forward again? You're saying the commission
The
doesn't?
I would think the
Salary
commission would
Commission
now
would
make
do that now, correct? That would be,
So we could provide direction for them to relook at that, or no? They just look at it, and then they decide we need 3% every year?
So,
Okay.
so I can maybe give some, we as part of our looking into this, we met with Andy Rolson. You know, the county, when they did this, they actually engaged WTA's HR director, Andy Rolson, so to facilitate the process. And it's really, I mean, you know, there'll be some certain HR, you know, human resource expertise that goes into generally how this is done, but ultimately it is the Salary Commission that's going to decide the salary and whether there'll be an annual increase in that salary, and it really supersedes existing statutes. There is a legal question that we're still looking into as to what the relationship is between the determination by a salary commission and the city charter. As you note, that there is a provision on the mayor's salary in the city's charter, but what the commission determines will supersede what we have in our current ordinances, and they will determine whether and to what extent there will be annual increases, and that determination will be final. And they'll determine how they're going to get to that point.
can I just ask one logistical question before we proceed here? In this evening's proceedings, do we have to bring both of those motions forward again? Or are we covered for that?
We can take it from committee direction, because ultimately you're going to have to vote on, you know, you're going to have to consider the ordinance itself.
Okay, so okay. Councilmember Barker? And
So
then,
I guess my concern with that is it seems to be a trend to be doing the 3%, and I guess I would like to have some input into that, because I don't feel that's super appropriate. I think that looking at a cost of living, looking at what that needs to be for the year is fine, but I can see where we're having problems in our budget already due to this is a trend, so therefore everybody's going to do it. And I would like to be part of a council that would at least have the conversation and maybe step forward and be willing to do something a little different, start a new trend.
and I might want to say that this is one person's opinion, and all opinions could be put forth to the commission board. So anybody can submit, if I'm understanding this correctly, anyone can submit their opinions and thoughts to the commission. Councilmember Knudsen.
Yeah, just a couple points. First of all, in 1997, we did this ourselves. We didn't have a commission. Thank God we're having a commission this time, because it was pretty rough. But secondly is, during the recession, we went 2 or 3 years without the 3%. We did. So it hasn't been, but it's a whole different ballgame. It's the best way to do it as a commission and not try to do it ourselves.
Councilmember Borne.
Yeah, I just think going with the commission is a good idea. It takes it out of our hands, where it shouldn't be anyway, about, necessarily with that. The people look at it objectively, make those kind of decisions, and then we don't,
Okay, any other questions? This is the positive part about putting it through to commission is that all of these seats get looked at, and there are some people, especially on our judicial side, who this affects a lot more than it does the city council members. So we have to keep that in mind, and having an impartial commission will really help in those matters. So any other questions or discussion on this commission? Okay, that and you have all the direction you need for that, and we can proceed on that. Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Brian and Peter. Okay, so number 8 is a work session regarding the draft 2017-2022 Transportation Improvement Program, also called the TIP. The 6-year TIP is adopted annually to plan and program public funding toward capital improvements to Bellingham's multimodal transportation network. State law, RCW 35-77-010, requires cities to adopt the TIP before July 1st each year. The draft 2017-2022 TIP is based on Public Works staff recommendation. Public Works staff presented the draft to the Public Works Advisory Board and the Transportation Commission on May 10th. Public Works staff presented specific funding information on all projects listed on the draft TIP, followed by a public hearing which was held on June 6, 2016, and now we have our council work session to consider the adoption of the draft 2017-22 TIP, and we will be discussing passing our resolution today, and I am going to turn this over to Ted Carlson, our Public Works Director.
Thank you. Ted Carlson, Public Works, along with Chris Como, Public Works Transportation Planner. Just to clarify that after this will be another work session on the Transportation Benefit District, which will influence the 6-year TIP. I don't think that it's entirely important on the order that we take them, but they will be related. So there may be some interaction during the discussion of the two items. Just a brief recap of the public hearing. We had a good participation in the public hearing, and then council has received written comment since the public hearing all the way up until the time of the packet. There were 3 general categories of comments on the projects that were included in the 6-year TIP, and one project actually wasn't on the 6-year TIP. Actually, 2 projects weren't. The Quiet Zone project, we received testimony from several members of the public that were in favor of the project. The general comment was that they would like to see the project move forward quicker, and I'll provide some recap and some update on where we're at on quiet zones. There was also testimony about Samish Way and whether or not there should be a project in the 6-year TIP that would identify some improvements along Samish Way, largely being driven by the Bellingham Housing Authority's proposal to redevelop the former Aloha Motel site. And then there were comments, written comments, regarding a project that we have not discussed, which was Fever Creek Bridge Crossing, which is on one of the Greenways trails near the Roosevelt Elementary School. And I think I'd like to start by addressing that project. And the good news is that that project is funded and will be moving forward. The Parks Department is already working on survey of that project. They're working with all of the regulatory agencies on the permitting. At this point, it's likely that the project will be built next summer because there are some fish windows, although in talking to Parks Department staff, there is an outside possibility that we may be able to get permits this year. And if that does happen, then the project would be constructed prior to the opening of the next school season in fall, school year in the fall. So they're working on it. Definitely heard loud and clear that that's a priority, and so that's the good news. That project is moving forward. So it does not need to be added to the 6-year TIP. It'll be funded with parks funding, I believe, Greenways money. So I'd like to address the second one I'd like to address is Samish Way, which was also a project that was not on the 6-year TIP. And we've had good conversations at the staff level, both Public Works and Planning and Community Development with the Bellingham Housing Authority about future improvements to Samish Way. As you're aware, the Housing Authority submitted a proposal for improvements on the Aloha site that would be phased in over a couple different years or several years, 2 different phases that would provide housing but also relocate their administrative offices to Samish Way. So it's a very positive project and significant investment on the corridor. The project that they submitted called for parking on Samish Way, so on-street parking. That's actually not consistent with the Urban Village Plan. The Samish Way Urban Village Plan has an approved cross-section that was adopted with the Urban Village Plan in 2007. The Housing Authority was very much aware of that when they submitted their application, but because of the desire to put commercial on the ground floor, there's would like to see on-street parking to help that be successful. At this point, there really is no project identified to put on the 6-year tip. The 6-year tip is really a planning document that facilitates funding, state and federal funding. Projects need to be on the 6-year tip to be eligible for transportation funding. But to do that, we have to have some type of capital project to be on the tip. And what is being requested is that we look at the cross section, which is currently a 5-lane section, look to see if Sandwich Way can be reduced to a 3-lane section, so center turn lane and 1 travel lane in each direction with appropriate bicycle facilities and on-street parking. To do that, we have to analyze the corridor because, as we mentioned, it's a 5-lane section right now, and as you know, it's a transportation network, and we look at how that impacts other areas of town, including as the waterfront redevelops, the intersections and the interchange at Sandwich Way. We believe that there's certainly a possibility of reducing the number of travel lanes there, but we really do have to look and see how that functions. And if it is possible to reduce it to a 3-lane section, how would we go about doing that? Because it's unlikely that we would be able to fund a project that would improve the entire section of Sandwich Way. It would be very, very expensive to do that. So what we're proposing and what we're moving forward with is doing a transportation corridor study, looking at Sandwich Way, looking at how, in fact, it could be perhaps converted to a 3-lane section, and if that is possible, how would we phase that in, come up with a project that could be funded and put on the 6-year tip this time next year when we update, as we do annually, update the 6-year tip. We've relayed that to the Housing Authority. Community Development and Public Works have met with the Housing Authority. Certainly they're in favor of looking at the cross-section, and they would like us to do it as quickly as possible, but I think they understand the process that we need to go through, which would also entail updating the urban village plan, because as I mentioned, the cross-section in the urban village plan does not show on-street parking throughout that section of Sandwich Way. So that's where we're at. We have already got a scope of work and funding in the 2016 budget to move forward with that transportation corridor study. We anticipate having that completed sometime around the first of the year, perhaps the first quarter of next year, which would certainly allow us to identify any projects to put on the 6-year tip next year. So that's the update on Sandwich Way. I'd be happy to answer any questions on that at this time if council has any. And again, staff would then recommend not putting it on the 6-year tip this year.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Yes, so on that last point, I think that what the Housing Authority is asking for is exactly what Bellingham also would want. We've talked about urban villages, and having street front commercial with adequate parking for customers and residences above is exactly what I think we want in there. So I'm very glad to hear that we're moving forward in a transportation corridor study. You said it's funded for this year and may be done early next year. What did the Housing Authority say on the timing of that? Because, of course, they want to move forward on their project. They want to engage in design. They want to know whether or not to include space for those commercial spaces in their design. How does that timing work for them? Have they given you feedback?
They have. They obviously would like us to move as quickly as possible, but where they're at is, as I mentioned, their project will be phased in, and the first phases will be on the side streets to Sandwich Way and not include the frontage along Sandwich Way. So I think that works towards the timing that we're laying out. It's advantageous. They would like to know as soon as possible because they want to keep the momentum with the potential funding agencies that they work with and have some level of certainty that the improvements along Sandwich Way will actually occur that will facilitate that ground floor commercial. And planning and community development are also working with them on perhaps putting commercial at the corners where you do have on-street parking on the side streets that would be helpful in providing some of that on-street parking for commercial. So while the timing of it is not ideal from their perspective, I think they understand that there's a process to update the urban village plan, get projects properly designed and engineered before we can put them on the 6-year tip if we have any hope of being competitive for grant funding, which we'll have to rely on for this project. So I think there's some options to work through with them, and the dialogue between the city and the Housing Authority, I think, has been good.
One other thing I'm wondering if you could touch on that we did get a lot of input and questions on was the railroad safe zones. And maybe could you review how the funding is set, that this city is not paying for all of this and this is not all funded? Maybe you could address that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's exactly right. The other project that we've heard about is the Quiet Zone. And just a brief history on that. The city did go through a quiet zone study, and maybe take even a further step back. A quiet zone is where improvements are made at grade railroad crossings that greatly reduce the ability of folks going around the cross arms. That's the issue that's trying to be addressed. That right now, when you have a typical signalized rail crossing, you have a signal cross arm that comes down only in your travel way, only in the direction that you're traveling. So if someone was so inclined, they could go into oncoming traffic and weave around the cross arms. So now, when you don't have a quiet zone, you just have a typical configuration. The railroad is required by federal law, the train, to blow their horn as they approach the intersections. They have to do that at all at-grade crossings. So that's the noise that people are hearing, the trains are warning folks that they're coming to an at-grade crossing. If a jurisdiction moves forward with implementing a quiet zone, improvements are made at each of the crossings to eliminate the ability of going around the cross arms. So there's a couple different ways to do that, or several different ways to do that. One of the simplest, most straightforward ways is to put in what's called a quad gate. So you put 4 cross arms so that there's one in each direction of travel and a vehicle can't go around them. It's blocking the entire travel way. There's other things that can be done with center medians rather than doing a full quad gate. Sometimes less expensive, but they also have other challenges in terms of restricting access to commercial driveways or streets. So each intersection needs to be reviewed for what, in fact, is the best solution. The city did a quiet zone study in 2007 looking at every crossing throughout the city along the main line. That was updated in 2012. In 2014, the council and the city and the mayor said we'd like to move forward with designating formal quiet zones within the city of Bellingham. And so there's a process that's laid out through the Code of Federal Regulations to do that, state or federal law. One of the things that has to be done is you have to do what's called a diagnostic, where you walk each of those crossings with all of the different regulatory agencies involved, including the rail operator, which in our case is Burlington Northern. We walk it with the Washington Utility Transportation Commission, the Federal Rail Administration, the port, and the city, Washington State Rail. All the parties walk the corridor and identify the improvements at each one of those intersections. We've done that. We've divided the city into 2 different quiet zones. One is called the Fairhaven Quiet Zone, which starts at the south end of the city and goes all the way up to the pedestrian crossing at the northern end of Boulevard Park. That's the Fairhaven Quiet Zone, all the crossings within that area. Moving north from the Pine Wharf Quiet Crossing all the way up to the most northern crossing is what we call the Waterfront Crossing, or Quiet Zone. So a little bit of history on what we've done. When we walked that corridor, all of the agencies said there's 2 crossings that need to be done first, and that's because there's some existing safety concerns at those crossings. One was the pedestrian crossing at the north end of Boulevard Park, and that crossing's been completed. It's been built to a quiet zone standard, so it meets all of the requirements of a quiet zone. And the second crossing was the C Street crossing, which has been closed for several years. We had some sight distance issues there. There has been accidents at that crossing. We closed it, and currently it's under construction, and it's being built to a quiet zone standard. So those 2 crossings, sometime in the next month or so, C Street will be open, and we will have built 2 crossings to a quiet zone standard. Those have been entirely funded by the city. They are relatively expensive, anywhere between $350,000 and $500,000 per crossing. There's a lot of reasons for the expense. It's not just the improvements at the intersections. It also includes upgrading all the warning signals along the rail. if the rails infrastructure at the crossing can't support the upgraded signal crossings, then there's some other work that needs to be done. All of that is included in the cost of improving the intersection, and the city, the local jurisdiction, bears that cost. The rail doesn't pay for any of it. So we've done those 2 crossings. Next year, in 2017, the city will be moving forward on the Laurel Street crossing. That's part of the Granary Laurel arterial that will serve the waterfront. There's a crossing at Laurel Street that will be built to quiet zone. And what's in the proposed 6-year tip is that the city look at the vehicle entrance to Boulevard Park, Bayview, it's called, and look at that crossing. So at this point, the city's only expense has been on C Street and on the pedestrian crossing at Boulevard Park. We put $250,000 REIT in the proposed draft tip to be considered. We've had a lot of discussion, certainly amongst staff, certainly with council and with the city's transportation commission, about funding the quiet zones. And obviously we're getting a lot of input from the community and support for moving forward with them. The challenge from a transportation perspective is that when you look at all the needs citywide, all the other projects on the 6-year tip, all the unfunded projects on the pedestrian master plan and the bicycle master plan, staff and the Transportation Commission have felt that there are other projects that are a higher transportation priority. There's no question that the community would like us to, certain community members would like us to move forward with the quiet zone. We proposed REIT. It's just a proposal, but we put REIT in there rather than transportation funding because we felt like it's a capital project. There's certainly a quality of life benefit, and I think that's what you're mostly hearing about. But from a transportation perspective, it's not the highest priority. So that's where we're at. That's staff's position on it, and I'd be happy to answer questions about what we're doing or what we're recommending, whatever council would like to discuss.
Councilmember Borneman.
Yeah, this particular project that this is geared at, I think, is especially important in that this is our most popular water access point in the city. I mean, cars coming down across that crossing to gain access to the water, to Boulevard Park, the Taylor Dock and things is, this is the place, and the people are down through there all the time. So the safety aspect of doing that one to those standards for the safety aspect, I think, really merits that this one happen before some of the others. But this is a safety issue because we've had problems on the water, on the walk-through access, and this one is such a popular, so well-used area to try to get in down to the water. So many times you can't even find any parking down there, but people are down and out because you can't even, on a nice day, you can't even get down there. So I think this one is especially important that we get built.
Councilmember Barker.
So in the quiet zones, if you were to do the one at Bay Street, it does have to be connected with several others for them to actually stop blowing their horn, correct? They won't just stop blowing them right at that crossing.
That's correct. Then all of the crossings within a designated quiet zone. So when we're talking about the Fairhaven quiet zone, everything from the north end of Boulevard Park all the way to the most southern crossing, which is Harris Street, all of those crossings would need to be improved before it would be designated as a quiet zone, and the trains would no longer be required to blow their horn. They always could blow their horn, but generally what we're hearing from jurisdictions that have implemented quiet zones, there's an 80 to 90% reduction in the sound or the noise from the horns. So the other crossings that would remain unimproved in Fairhaven would be there's a crossing at the ferry terminal, there's a private boat haul-out crossing, and then there's a crossing at Harris Street. All of those crossings, so the 3 remaining crossings are actually under port jurisdiction, not the city's jurisdiction. And the port has been certainly supportive of implementing a quiet zone, but at this point there hasn't been any funding discussed from the port. The other thing I would mention is we have been working with the neighborhood. There are other funding alternatives. We're always looking at grant opportunities, but grants for quiet zones, we haven't come across any at this point. Doesn't mean we won't find some or something might not come free, but we haven't seen that yet. But we have been working with some individuals on the potential of private funding. So identifying a local improvement district, an LID, where the private citizens within the area of benefit could be assessed. The city of Vancouver, Washington has done that, so it's certainly, there's a precedent for it. It's a bit of a process to go through, heavily regulated process, a financing tool, a local improvement district that is prescribed in RCW exactly how it needs to be done. It would require a sound study. It would require an appraisal of all the properties within the area of benefit, and there's ample opportunity for people within that area to comment on the LID and protest the assessment, and City Council would have to approve the process. So there's some interest in that, and we're working with the neighborhood on that. I think that might be a viable process. It would probably cost around $150,000 just to set that up, go through the noise study and the appraisal of all of the properties identified within the area of benefit. Those costs could then ultimately be included in the LID and recovered through the assessment. So that is another potential funding opportunity.
Councilmember Lillquist.
So we do want to get to talking about the TIP itself, but one more question on the rail crossings. I believe that Congressman Larson sponsored a bill that passed that provides a minuscule pot of money nationwide for rail crossing issues in city jurisdictions. I don't know the details. Maybe you know more than I do. Is that whatever was created the potential to grow into something that could provide funding, or is it designed to do something different than that?
Yeah, I mean, something could come out of that through as that funding becomes clearer in terms of how it's going to be distributed out to the states and the regional transportation organizations. At this point, what we're seeing is the money going towards at-grade separation. So looking at at-grade crossings and separating the conflicts, so overpasses, underpasses. We've met with Congressman Larson's staff several times, and it is a potential. He's definitely very interested in rail safety and crossings, and so something may come out of that. At this point, we haven't seen anything that would apply directly to quiet zones other than a very small amount of money that has been set aside for fencing along the rail. Oftentimes that's a component of a quiet zone because it's not just vehicles, it's also pedestrians, and so you may have to fence along the rail corridor for some amount of distance each side of the intersection, and there's some money available for that.
Well, I guess I'm surprised that they're focusing on at-grade separations. I mean, it's great if you can separate the railroad from the road, but it's also the most expensive way to make a safe crossing. I mean, the best way, but the most expensive way.
Councilmember Borneman.
Yeah, I would like to move approval of the resolution adopting the 2017 through 2022 Transportation Improvement Program.
I'll second it, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank Ted, Chris, and the whole staff. This gets better and better every year, and I mean that sincerely. And one of the reasons it's getting better is because of the staff we have, and the council's letting our professional staff do their job, engineers, street people, everybody that works on this. Terry, remember, years ago, we might as well have scheduled a 2-hour root canal than do the TIP program. That's how bad it was getting. It was war, it was political. Now it is great. I look forward to it every year, and it just gets better and better. So I just want to take this opportunity and thank them for the job they do. Another great example, the award I heard on the radio the other day we won on Alabama Street. Mm-hmm. That happened because you took the time to go out into the community and have all those meetings. It's amazing. There still might be a couple detractors, but that's not bad for the amount of work that was done on that road. So you guys, we let the staff do their job. That's what happened.
Ted, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the comment, and staff's done a nice job on this. The draft TIP does have that section on the TBD, and President Vargas, maybe we should take the TBD vote first, now that I think about it, because the TIP assumes the split between two projects.
Right.
And we should have that discussion. That was the basis of the TBD public hearing, and maybe take that item first. I apologize for that. It probably should have been first.
So switch the two agenda items and come back to this?
Come back. We've had the discussion, but perhaps delay the vote until you have the TBD discussion.
Okay, and Councilmember Lillquist, you have something, do you want to?
That's exactly where I was going. I
Okay.
actually am uncomfortable with how much we've removed the transit component from the TBD and also from the TIP. I'd like to leave behind kind of pointers or indicators. I was separate to propose a small change to the TIP language to kind of put in a little indication that the transit is sort of still somewhere on the table. So we can come back to that, but I'd also like to do the same thing in the TBD resolution to at least put in a little marker for where the transit concerns are still kind of part of the larger picture.
Mayor Kelly.
Yeah, I agree with Ted and Mike. I think we should do the TBD first. The interesting thing at the WTA meeting, and Michael, maybe this is coming from the discussion we had, I talked to Pete after the meeting, and what he asked for was some mention about how we would work transportation projects into our complete roads system, which is what we were always going to do, and then that there would be some kind of a criteria or and I said that was something that we would have to discuss, because for me that was a little bit more detailed than what I wanted to do. But I think the idea of putting something in there, Michael, did you have something written?
Well, let me first make a motion that we table the current vote until after the TBD vote, and then parliamentarily it would immediately come back after the vote.
Second.
I'm good with that. Do we need to vote on that? Or can we just, yeah? Okay.
There's a motion.
Okay, I guess there's a motion. We've got to vote. All those in favor of switching the agenda items and returning back to the TIP vote after the TBD, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 6-0.
Oh. Yes, Kelly, I would suggest in the resolution for the TBD, we're now on that topic, is that correct? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do we want
Why don't we have
to
a
wait and do the
presentation before
little?
you have your motion?
Let's move into the agenda item and then throw that on the table. Is that okay?
But
okay.
I will want to answer Kelly's question at that time.
I'll wait until you've done your procedural stuff. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. And I'll put you first on that. Is that okay? All right. So we are moving instead to discuss the TBD funding allocation for the 2017-2022 six-year transportation improvement. And since the implementation of the TBD, well, all of this stuff is the same as before, but the change is in 2010, funding has been allocated between 3 projects on the city's 6-year TIP. 1, arterial resurfacing, 2, non-motorized projects, and 3, transit enhancements. The contract with WTA for supplemental transit service has expired, and WTA is no longer requesting operational support. A public hearing was held on June 6, 2016 to receive public input on a proposed change to the project allocation that would split the TBD funding between arterial resurfacing and non-motorized projects, no longer funding transit enhancements. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Ted, if there's any other additional remarks that you wanted to make on that.
Just a very brief recap of what you heard at the public hearing, and I don't believe you've received, other than the letter from Pete Stark, any written comment since the public hearing. What we heard from the speakers at the public hearing was a desire to maintain transit service and concern over changing the TIP to remove the transit component from TBD funding. And we talked about this, and I believe it's in the staff memo. WTA and, of course, the mayor and the folks up there that sit on the board know that the WTA board is no longer requesting operational support from the TBD, so that is a significant change. And in fact, the service plan coming out of the strategic plan that WTA is currently working on will show an increase in service funded by the WTA using some of their reserves and other funding to provide an increase of either $1 million or $1.5 million of services annually without TBD support. So that's a change, certainly a change from the past TBD allocations where we funded primarily Sunday service but other enhanced services. So staff is recommending, because of that change and no longer a desire to have us fund services, that we split to just the 2 TBD projects, no longer funding transit. As we mentioned during the public hearing and previous work session, transit does still benefit from the 2 broader categories: non-motorized pedestrian improvements, bicycle improvements, by providing easier access to transit through sidewalk extensions or crosswalks, and also benefit through resurfacing of arterials by just the actual resurfacing itself, as well as bus pullout. So we believe there's still a transit component, but providing just 2 projects within the 6-year TIP will give us a little bit more flexibility to direct the TBD money to the highest priority. So that's staff's position. Certainly very supportive of transit. It's a major component of our transportation network, and certainly a big part in our ability to meet our mode shift goals in the future. And we just would like to have a little bit more flexibility to fund the highest priority projects.
Okay. Councilmember Littlequist, did you want to start with your comment?
Yeah, thank you. So where to start? So I think what's on my mind is the fact that when the voters approved the TBD, transit was one of the 3 components, and I don't want to lose sight of that fact. And as we're talking informally, we're indicating that transit is still on our mind, it's still part of our considerations. I just want to suggest an amendment to one of the whereases, one of the recitals, to indicate in writing what the full status is on WTA's position on potential future funding. So here's what I'm going to move to amend the 6th recital, which currently reads, whereas the contract, on page 438, whereas the contract with the TBD and WTA for enhanced transit service is expiring at the end of 2016, and the WTA board has stated they no longer need operational support for the TBD, and then I would move that we add the language, comma, although WTA has indicated they anticipate future capital projects within Bellingham for which they may seek TBD support. Yeah, so I would just add that. I think it's an accurate, complete reading, and it kind of puts in the marker that we've already talked about, that in the future that might be a possibility. This doesn't actually change the split. The split goes forward 50-50 unaltered. I so move.
Second.
Discussion, Councilmember Murphy.
I want to speak to supporting this. The thing that I want to make clear is that we are not bound by this eternally. We can always get a due process going so we can amend the TBD and the TIP. We just have to do our process, because we want to definitely be supportive of transit. And this is not, we're at an interesting time where the WTA has some future things going, but we don't have the concrete numbers yet to really support it. But as those numbers come forward, we want to support that. So I appreciate the amendment to be inclusive of that.
Okay, so any other discussion? All right, so we have an amendment in front of us. This is for point number 6 in our whereas of our resolution, to add the language.
Shall I read it again?
Yes, please.
What I'm proposing is, comma, although WTA has indicated they anticipate future capital projects within Bellingham for which they may seek TBD support.
Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. Okay, back to our, so back to the resolution at hand. Was there anything else? No? Okay, all right. So Councilmember Littlequist.
I move to pass the resolution as amended.
Second.
Okay, so the motion in front of us to pass the TBD funding with as amended. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. And that was committee item number 9. And we are now going to move back to committee item number 8, which is the TIP.
I'll move approval of a resolution passing the 2016 TIP.
Second. Councilmember Littlequist?
The other half of this The other half of this is I'm hoping to add to the project narrative to include WTA more explicitly. Project number 2's description for non-motorized transportation improvements. Again, this doesn't change any of the proposed programs, but I think it kind of memorializes what I just talked about. So currently, the second sentence in the project narrative reads, non-motorized improvements are primarily prioritized through the pedestrian and bicycle master plans, but also through grant funding opportunities and other capital improvement needs. I would add at the end of that, before the end of that sentence, and other capital needs such as those of the WTA. So I would move that we change the project narrative, and I'd like to hear from staff.
Ted.
Thank you. I did want to point out in Pete's letter, Pete Stark's letter, he talked about a couple things, and I think there's things that we can address and staff would recommend including into the 6-year tip. One is the addition of Telegraph Road. It's a project that Pete specifically spoke about in their service plan as part of their strategic plan update. They're proposing to move service onto Telegraph Road between James Street and Deemer. And it's a street that actually is seeing quite a bit of development. There'll be improvements that are installed as part of private development. We would propose to add that project as an unfunded project to the 6-year tip, but be a project that does support transit, and in the future the council could consider using TBD money for a project like that. I think it is very much in line with what Council Member Lilliquist just mentioned, but add the project to the 6-year tip so it would also be eligible for state and federal funding.
So that would be 2 amendments to the tip. Am I understanding that correctly? Yes. If that is the case?
The Telegraph project is actually in your packet.
Oh,
it's project number 16.
It's number 16.
So it is.
So is there any language that needs to change in that, or it is as is? Okay.
The project narrative for Telegraph actually very specifically calls out the transit function it provides.
Okay. Thank you. So we have 1 amendment then in front of us. Is that correct? Okay. And we did a motion and second. So the motion in front of us is to amend the tip for project number 2 to include language that specifically identifies WTA projects.
Yeah,
is
the
that
language
correct?
is such as those of WTA, so it's more an example, not a requirement.
Okay. Discussion, comments?
Just from staff, any problems with that? Does that language work okay?
That language works.
Councilmember Barker? Good, all right. So the motion in front of us, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. That was for the amendment for the number 2 item on the tip. We have the resolution in front of us. Councilmember Barker?
I left for a little bit. Are we still in the place where we can ask questions about the tip?
We absolutely can.
We are, okay. I at first had some reservations about the quiet zones, and I wanted to publicly state them because I got a lot of feedback from constituents that kind of were informing my concerns. I took some time, spoke with the mayor, and so I was able to get my concerns answered, but I think it's important to make sure all those people that are out there that might have similar. There are many times we get constituents that are upset about, especially up in the Barkley area, that they don't feel like a road is safe, yet that we don't have funding for that because we have deemed as a city that it's not having accidents, it's fine. So an area like Bay Street was difficult for me because although I've had to pass constituents on to staff about roads where they really feel unsafe, and staff has been able to say, look, that's just not something that's a priority right now because there hasn't been collisions, these other, and variety of other things. For me, the Bay Street was very similar because we haven't had collisions there. It's been just fine. Pedestrians haven't been hit, cars haven't been hit, and it's not necessarily going to create quiet right now. So what I did understand is that by reserving that space with some refunding, it could make it more eligible for federal money if it was available. So therefore, I'm in support of this being here. But Living in an area with many other constituents that deal with all kinds of things that wake them up at night. We have a concrete plant that runs 48 hours at a time. We have Osier that can beep all through the night. We have rail crossings that will never fit a quiet zone standard because they're going over top of a bridge that for some reason people want to walk across at night. So they're always going to be honking their horns. And we have airplanes that are considerably, we're growing our aircraft over time, our air traffic. So when it comes down to, and I'm very sensitive to a quality of life and people being waken up at night, but if we start to go down that route, I want to make sure that we take time and have a conversation about all of those things and if we're really going to be putting city funding. This one I'm in support of because I do understand now that federal part is really important for it to be here. But we had a lot of talk about it's unsafe and we're being woken up and these are all the things that we need to take care of. And the people, quite honestly, that are affected by the concrete and Osier and the airplanes and all kinds of other things are our most at-risk populations who are living in poverty already. So if we are going to go about those conversations, I'd like to have that separate if that's what we're tackling, but it was made very clear to me that that's not really what we're tackling here. We're trying to get to this quiet zone space, more for safety, and then it's particularly federal funding. So hopefully I explained it as well as you explained it to me, but I did want to clarify that because I am not supporting a quality of life issue on here. And I think if we get to that point as a council, we owe it to all of the citizens to have a discussion about putting money equitably to what's waking people up at night.
Council members, any other questions? No? I just wanted to say something on that as well, is that keeping in mind that the description, quiet zones, leads people to, I think, a different image of what this actually is, and that it is railway safety that we are trying to provide, which will in turn create a quiet zone. I think that all of those things are important to consider. Also wanted to thank you for addressing the Fever Creek Bridge because we did get a lot of comments on that. And I talked to lots of young students who are very excited about that bridge being replaced. And so just for my report out, I want to make sure that I'm stating this correctly. But Fever Creek Bridge is in our plan for parks. It is going through the planning and the funding will come through parks. And we are hoping to get permits done. And if all goes well, then it will be built for the fall school year. That is our hopeful. But if not, then the timeline again was, because I poor little students, so I promised we'd do our best for it.
Yeah, so yes, if everything goes well and the permits are expedited, which the city doesn't really have any control over, those are state fish and wildlife permits, then perhaps it could be built this summer in time for school in fall. But probably the more likely scenario is that we build it next summer because these are things that have to be done during the fish window. You can't do the work in the fall and the winter. It has to be in the summer. More likely it will be built in the summer of 2017. But we will continue to keep working on that. It's Parks Department is working as quickly as they can on moving that forward.
Okay. And maybe we could do some outreach to the school because there is a lot of concern about the safe to school zone and the bridge, et cetera, and so that they can understand the complications of governments and permitting and et cetera, and understand that this is a priority for us, but that we don't have complete control over how it happens.
Okay.
In regards to,
I was just going to answer your question. Yeah, we have been in contact with the school district about our plans. We're moving forward with permitting and design, but as Ted says, those have quite a lead time, and then we have the construction window. So getting it open by fall may not happen, but we're moving ahead.
Okay. Maybe we could submit all those children's and students' letters to the state and they could deal with that. So, thank you very much, Leslie, for your work on the Fever Creek Bridge.
Can I say one thing to that?
Councilmember Barker.
So, to all the constituents that did write in, especially some of the youth, to advocate for themselves, I think it's really important to note that this whole process, and I'm learning a lot right now, so I'm kind of trying to help all the people that are learning along with me. it really is informed by the public. And this has been an issue for a while, and there would be, you can make change in the city. And the staff is clearly trying very hard to make sure that we're doing all the things that we need to do. So I think it's less about, yeah, we got that and we got staff to do it, and more about, we advocated for ourselves and we're able to help the city understand what we need, and then the city was able to respond. That it's much more of a kind of a friendship, easy way to work. And I'm learning also in how to get those kinds of things done. So I will continue to learn new ways to communicate constituents' concerns so that we can all use our time wisely on that. So I do appreciate the staff's willingness to look at that issue and to respond so quickly. So thank you.
Do we have any other questions on our tip? Maybe I know we did a motion before we bounced back and forth, but maybe we should.
We need the main motion now.
We've already had two motions on it. I made a motion before that was tabled, and then a second motion was made.
All right,
so
moving right
I think
along.
we've got
So
need a vote
we
on
have
Need a vote on it.
Yeah.
Let's, so our vote for approval, the motion for the passing our 6-year tip. All those in favor? Oh, wait.
As amended.
Just to clarify, I believe it's as amended. Michael, council member Lilliquist
thank
had
you.
an amendment on project number 2.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. As amended, our tip for our draft tip. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 6-0. Okay, and that's end of committee of the whole. Nope.
Pretty clear. We're ahead of time.
So we have we have one set of minutes in front of us, and this is for the committee meetings for June 6, 2016.
Move approval.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0.
I'll get it.
Older new business.
Oh, it was me.
Oh, April.
Councilmember Lilliquist.
Yeah, I'd just like to bring up something to the public as well as to the rest of the council here. Last week, I took a walk through one of the homeless camps that the city is cleaning up. It's really an eye-opener there, and there's been quite a discussion. There's a real mixed feeling about the desire to help people who are unwillingly homeless, but at the same time, there are some very serious negative impacts with some of these camps, which can harbor a lot of unsavory and dangerous activity, such as the drug needles that are on the ground. I want to point out that the administration has developed the Safe Outdoor Program. It's a multi-departmental and in cooperation with Conservation Corps and the Opportunity Council to reach out to the camp inhabitants before any cleanup goes in place. It's a difficult thing that the city is dealing with. It's a fine balance between not allowing negative behaviors that harm the community, but also not in some way further victimizing those people who do find themselves homeless. And I just wanted to point out to the public that we're trying to strike that balance, and to thank the administration for doing what they can to strike that balance.
Thank you. A couple other things. I just wanted to let you know that our annual convention for the Association of Washington Cities is this week. Many of us will be attending, but also wanted to acknowledge Mayor Kelly, who won the Advocacy Award through the AWC, and thank her very much for all her work she does in our city, but also the model that she represents for the rest of our state. So congratulations, Mayor Kelly. Thank you very much. And we'll have a report on the AWC next meeting. Anything else for older new business? Councilmember Murphy.
I just wanted to double check that we would take a moment of silence, hopefully at tonight's meeting.
It is
for
on
the
our
older
agenda.
trend.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we are absolutely going to address that. And we have an executive session to attend to. Will be a report out in our regular meeting tonight. There are 2 executive sessions. Potential litigation, claim number 2016-24, Brady, approximately 10 minutes. Potential litigation, claim number 2015-50, Brady, approximately 15 minutes. And I will be back here by 20 to 4, so 3:40 to adjourn. Thank you.